This video is sponsored by Squarespace. Stay tuned until the very end to hear more. In 1787, after 6 years of existence as a united country and 4 years of total independence, the United States had called a convention for the discussion and revision of the country's then governing document, the Articles of Confederation. The war for independence had been a cohesive force which drove the states to put aside their differences and cooperate in the name of independence. However, the Articles had only provided for a very loose union, or rather a league of friendship between the states, and established a near-powerless central government which stood incapable of carrying out the national agenda and preserving national unity in peacetime. Now, for some, this was perfectly acceptable. In fact, the average citizen at the time was far more likely to hold loyalties to their home state over the larger union, and anything less would have been challenged as oppressive, tyrannical, or monarchical, identifying the establishment of a strong central government for so large a country as impossible without the use of coercion or the sacrifice of local or individual liberties. However, the founders recognized that failure to definitively unite as a single nation or create a joint long-term strategy would almost certainly spell the death of the Union, be it through internal secession or foreign conquest. It was decided by a majority of the convention that the loose articles needed not merely a revision but a complete replacement by a new document, which established a more thoroughly centralized federation of states with a strong and capable federal government to promote interstate cooperation and closer union. As such, the supporters of this movement came to be known as the Federalists, but of course not all those in attendance supported the new document. 16 of the convention's 55 representatives expressed their opposition either by refusing to attend the signing or simply refusing to sign. Regardless, the Constitution was voted on, signed by the majority 39 in favor, and was sent for ratification by the individual states, who put forward their own conditions for ratification, resulting in the Bill of Rights as an addition to the new Constitution. George Washington would be unanimously elected to the newly established executive office as the first president of the United States, and with him would come a Federalist majority in both houses of Congress. The newly formed judicial branch also required Washington to appoint a number of judges to the Supreme Court. He'd nominate a total of 10 before his presidency was over, all of whom belonged to the Federalist Party, which Washington himself was strongly sympathetic to, though he officially served without party affiliation and appointed a staunch anti-Federalist to his cabinet for the sake of promoting ideological unity. Washington would largely carry forward a Federalist agenda, and with the faction well rooted in all three branches of government, would lay strong foundations contributing to internal stability, long-term financial growth, positive relations with Britain, and national military strength. After 2 terms, Washington would be succeeded by his vice president, John Adams, as you might have guessed, also a Federalist. But by the time Adams had taken office, the tides had begun to turn. The anti-Federalist, anti-establishment faction was gaining influence, briefly taking control of the House and even developing into a well-defined political party, the Democratic Republicans, with Washington's former anti-Federalist cabinet member at its head. That man was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson ran against Adams in the election of 1796, but narrowly lost by 3 electoral votes. Because of the way in which elections worked at the time, Jefferson was made Adams' vice president and used his position in office to gain inside knowledge and leverage which raised his own political reputation and which provided him ammunition to use against Adams and the Federalists, provoking the media, conspiring with France, and inciting regionalism and nullification across the country. Adams' primary concern was continuing the legacy of Washington, keeping the US out of foreign conflicts, building the domestic economy, and in a Federalist fashion, using government power to maintain national order. Jefferson, however, made this out to appear as though Adams was betraying the French who had lent the US so much support in the War of Independence to instead demonstrate his loyalty to Britain. He made Adams appear to be a tyrannical monarchist intent on stealing the people's wealth through taxation and silencing the opposition through military force and the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were meant to keep foreign influence out of America at a time when war in Europe was brewing and factions expressly intended on drawing the US into it. When the election of 1800 came around, the damage to Adams' reputation had been done, and Jefferson, through his rallying of the public around populist ideals of democracy, decentralization, and the power of the common man over the coastal elites which largely made up the Federalist Party, emerged victorious with an electoral vote of 73 over Adams' 65, as well as a far greater proportion of the popular vote. The election, sometimes referred to as the Revolution of 1800, broke Federalist hold over the country, and over time the faction would fade further and further away from all 3 branches of government, never retaking the presidency following, and eventually dying out as a party. Jefferson, now in power, would bring about a new age in the country, one defined not by state unity but by sovereignty of the states. The shifting of national power away from the coastal urban trade economies of the Northeast to the inland agricultural economies of the South and West, vesting upon the land-owning farmer the same political significance once concentrated within the country's elite few. Liberty was expanded, but at great cost. Without an active effort by the central government to pull the individual states together, regionalism rose, Anglo-American relations previously mended under Federalist rule now plummeted to new lows, and military power was kept weak and decentralized, all the while much-needed infrastructure to better bind the country together and facilitate smoother interstate trade and commerce went unconstructed. Only following 3 years of conflict with Britain in the War of 1812 did the Democratic Republicans come to recognize the necessity of certain Federalist policies whose adoption was still met with resistance and began to fracture the ruling party along new ideological lines. The masses kept the Democratic Republicans in power for over 2 decades, this hold only being broken when a new contender offered even more authority to the common man, that having been Andrew Jackson and his Democrat Party. The party, with its emphasis on agrarianism and states' rights, became a perfect platform through which the South could assert itself over the federal government, though as this power slipped away, so did the result lead to secession and the Civil War. But what if all that changed? What if Thomas Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans never came to power? Jefferson personally benefited in the election of 1800 from a much larger voter turnout, one which he was able to rally against the Federalists by portraying them in daily media as selfish, unpatriotic elites detached from the concerns of the common man and the national interest. However, the Federalists themselves contributed to their own defeat by allowing internal divisions to drive support away from Adams for being too moderate. That being said, the Democratic Republicans still won bigly in not merely the presidential election of that year, but also the congressional elections. Imagining an election path in which Jefferson loses to Adams is fairly simple. We could simply propose that New York remain loyal to the Federalists instead of flip Republican as it had. New York State had been at the time a battleground between a pair of political societies representing either party. Tammany Hall on one hand controlled by the Democratic Republican Aaron Burr, and the Society of the Cincinnati led by Federalist Alexander Hamilton on the other. Hamilton, however, as earlier mentioned, helped sabotage his own party's chances for victory by aggressively criticizing Adams in hopes of raising support for an alternative Federalist candidate. Had Hamilton stood by Adams' side for the sake of party unity and worked to keep New York in Federalist hands, at the very least a presidential victory could have been drawn and Democratic-Republican momentum dragged to a halt, possibly reversing opposition gains during the midterm election and securing a follow-up Federalist administration. That is not a guarantee, however. Adams could very well win the presidency only for the Democratic-Republicans to consolidate power in Congress and make a grab for the presidency in 1804. To prevent the Republicans from becoming the massively influential force they would eventually become, we'd need to turn to the party's other leader, James Madison. While Jefferson was perhaps the most spirited voice of the Democratic-Republican ideology, James Madison had long been the party's more moderate brain, the man who kept the faction from falling into unappealing radicalism which might alienate necessary voters. Madison had been instrumental to Jefferson's ascension to power, personally advising Washington to provide Jefferson his cabinet position in the first place, and later encouraging Thomas to seek the presidency after he had briefly retired from politics, then helping him to build a strong platform which attacked Adams' follies while masking Jefferson's own checkered past. Chiefly his support of the bloody French Revolution, promotion of nullification, and refusal to attend Washington's funeral. Madison, however, had historically been close to Washington and the old administration, even having been a Federalist in the original sense of supporting the Constitution before it became a formal political party. His animosity rather was directed toward the policies of Alexander Hamilton, whose vision of federalism he believed to be wholly incompatible with the Constitution. The final straw for Madison had been Washington's acceptance of the Jay Treaty, which sought to improve relations between the US and Britain, but which Madison believed humiliated the US for not adopting a harsher stance against this empire which continued to violate American sovereignty by interfering in Franco-American trade. We might suppose that in an alternate timeline, Madison simply accepts the treaty and remains close with the Federalist establishment, thus preventing Jefferson from ever becoming vice president. Or alternatively, we could suppose that Adams, given his more moderate position, convincingly presents himself to both Madison and Hamilton as a favorable middle ground between both their visions for the country, thus gaining the support of the Hamiltonian faction and keeping the Federalists united, while dividing the Democratic Republicans by leaving the party solely in the hands of Jefferson, who without Madison's support might not even pursue the presidency, and if he did would be severely impacted politically by his break with the moderate Madison. Lack of party unity cost the Democratic Republicans not only the presidency, but a significant number of congressional seats. Despite this, given the large margins by which they had won in our world, they would still carry a narrow majority in the House of Representatives, though one which would not last for very long. Now, a second Adams administration would entail 4 major changes. Firstly, Adams did not appear to have a personal agenda he sought to push, but rather aimed to diligently and loyally continue the policies begun under Washington, even retaining Washington's presidential cabinet members, 3 of whom were Hamiltonians but whom Adams replaced toward the end of his term. Re-election would likely see the retention of the Adams cabinet, including John Marshall as Secretary of State. In our timeline, Marshall was speedily appointed to the Supreme Court upon the short-notice resignation of Chief Justice Oliver Ellsworth. He wasn't a first choice for many Federalists, but given the incoming Jefferson administration, there wasn't very much time to find an alternative. Now, it wasn't that Marshall wasn't an exceptional statesman. In fact, he could have been expected to be a valuable asset to the country regardless of where he was placed. However, when the Adams administration was coming to an end, the judicial branch remained the last institution that the Federalists firmly held on to. However, in the past, the court hardly found its hand forced by the legislative and executive branches, largely because the three branches were in step with the Federalist agenda, making it seem like a wasteful position for someone so talented. However, when Jefferson took power, Marshall made the court a powerful tool to challenge unconstitutional actions by the president and Congress. Without Marshall and without an opposition leading the other branches, the Supreme Court would likely remain a largely minor player in American politics for at least a short time longer. Secondly, the US Navy would see continued expansion under Secretary Benjamin Stoddert, even despite hostilities with France having been resolved. In our world, plans had already been underway to build 12 74-gun ships, which would have made the United States far more capable of deterring additional foreign aggression. However, with the election having been lost and Jefferson making clear his pro-French views in opposition to naval expansion, Adams had rushed through a piece of legislation setting a new standard for peacetime naval capabilities. It would actually reduce the size of the Navy in hopes of discouraging Jefferson from shrinking it even further, though still he did, bringing it to merely defensive levels. But this time, things are different. Thirdly, the likelihood of Adams acquiring the Louisiana Territory and by what means are questionable. In our world, the purchase had come about from a number of convenient coincidences which made Napoleon eager to sell and saw the US and France on relatively positive terms leading up to the purchase. Adams and a Federalist-led government, on the other hand, might bring the country to the brink of war with France, especially upon the apparent emergence of Napoleon's colonial ambitions for North America. Now, Louisiana's coast held significant value to the Federalists, as did the Mississippi River on account of how much it would benefit the national trade and shipping economy, as well as the additional security provided by expelling another European power from the continent, especially one right on the American border. However, the land was far more valuable to the agrarian Democratic Republicans, who, if new states were to be carved out of this region, would see a massive surge in their number of potential voters. Much like the free state, slave state debate of our timeline, Federalists of this alternate timeline would hesitate to create new, largely agricultural states on account of how likely they would be to support the opposition. Though still the goal of the administration would be neutrality, ties with Britain would almost certainly be strengthened as had been done before, while at the same time relations with France degraded, making Napoleon less likely to sell the territory, though its future remains very murky. Perhaps the US and Britain drive France out of the coastal region by force, securing it under American control. Perhaps following the Napoleonic Wars, Louisiana Territory reverts back to Spanish rule, who themselves might sell to the United States or lose the region in a later conquest. Britain might acquire the territory as a spoil of war from France, confining the US to the east coast, while solidifying its own hold over the Caribbean, possibly also losing the region in a future conquest. Or, Napoleon may still sell to the US regardless of previously mentioned conditions, simply recognizing Louisiana as neither valuable nor defendable following the failed expedition to retake Haiti. For the sake of simplicity, we'll just assume the US does acquire the Louisiana Territory in full, since expansion seems nearly inevitable. However, how America comes to acquire the territory in this timeline is somewhat flexible. We might expect attempts to be made to delay the ascension to statehood of many of these largely agricultural areas until they develop pro-Federalist coastal urban centers to balance things out in Federalist favor, although if this was carried out, it probably wouldn't last for very long unless more radically Federalist leadership took power, or national opinion, especially in the South, shifted in Federalist favor. And though a new war with France is possible in this timeline, the likelihood of the War of 1812 occurring between the US and Britain drops significantly, as the Federalists had strongly opposed it in our timeline, and Adams' leadership would put the two countries on a trajectory toward friendship. Finally, without the rise of Jefferson and his faction, the Federalists would have an additional 4 years to adapt to the changing political landscape and further solidify their hold over the country, which was quickly slipping away from them following Washington's passing. It'd be clear that if victory was to be achieved in the following election, a superior candidate to Adams needed to be chosen, one who appealed to not only the Federalist base in New England, but to the country as a whole. Alexander Hamilton, the party's leader, carried a strong reputation, but his views were far too extreme for the average voter and would not be able to bridge the party gap. Instead, attention would turn to Adams' Secretary of State, John Marshall, a veteran of the War for Independence who had been humbly born in a rural community in the middle state of Virginia to a hard-working family. Marshall was bright, capable, and loyal to the Federalist cause, but not so inconsiderate of the common man's plight. In character and in background, he was the ideal figure to unite the country under the Federalist banner, and one who could easily stand toe-to-toe with Jefferson if he aimed to run again. His own modest background exposing Jefferson's aristocratic upbringing and bringing into question the legitimacy of his democratic republican ideals. As he had done as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in our world, so would Marshall, as President of the United States, re-secure the Federalist vision for America through long-standing policies which promoted state interdependence, the rule of law, and an overall stronger and more closely united America. The US of Z thanks you for watching, and a big thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring today's video. As I'm sure most of you know, Squarespace is a platform which provides you all the tools necessary to build your own website. Loaded with social media integrations, streamlined e-commerce capabilities, and powerful community and blogging tools, Squarespace allows you to connect with your audience and generate revenue through gated members-only content. Manage your members, send email communications, and leverage audience insights all in one easy-to-use platform. Go to squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/monsterzy to save 10% on your first purchase of a website or domain. Links will be in the description. Support your Legion by liking the video, or join our ranks by subscribing for more. Mr. Z,